and give your thoughtful comments. Feel free. Twitch ID is right there. I think it's called Wolves in the Company of Men, no spaces. Go for it. Okay, I'll turn down the lights. Excuse me. I mean, you can do it.
All right, I don't know what
the front and back. Okay. All right. Today we're doing a short intro to synthesis. Synthesis. Presented by our very own Joseph. And I'll hand it off to him. Round of applause.
Is it recording? I didn't check.
Oh, are you recording?
Yes, I am. Okay, it's fine. Okay, there we go. All right, so welcome to Synth Design. We're gonna primarily go over the main structure of synthesizers, commonly how they're used, specifically subtractive synthesis. We'll get into what that means later on. We're also gonna briefly cover alternative methods of synthesis. But first off, before we can even say what subtractive synthesis is, we need to cover how sounds work fundamentally. So if you think of a sound at a certain frequency, say I don't know, 100 hertz, right? We're looking for some waveform that repeats every 100 hertz, which is 100 times a second every 10 milliseconds. So of course a pure tone at, which is just a sine wave, repeating every 10 milliseconds will repeat. But also a sine wave going twice as fast, repeating every 5 milliseconds will repeat again at 10 milliseconds, as you can see on the chart. And again for a sine wave 3 times as fast and 4 times as fast and so on. And it turns out for a given frequency, you can decompose any given sound at that frequency into just a bunch of sine waves at these relative frequencies, with the underlying tone being based on their relative volumes. I have some terminology here. The key to note is that this series of sine waves is called the overtone series, and any particular sine wave in that sequence is called a partial. And that's a term I'm going to be going back to multiple times throughout the seminar. So, synthesis is primarily divided into 2 different methods, additive and subtractive. And the difference is where those partials in your sound are coming from. In additive, you are explicitly programming the volume of each of the partials in the harmonic series. Whereas in subtractive synthesis, which we're going to be looking at, which is by far the more common method of synthesis, you start with a waveform which ideally is relatively rich in those partials, and by a few methods you're carving away at that sound to get what you want. And there are some other methods of synthesis that are based on subtractive, such as FM synthesis and wavetable synthesis, which we will be touching on briefly near the end of the seminar. And one other distinction I want to make is between analog and digital synthesizers. So the difference is we have our, I guess this will be the better diagram. You have some waveforms ideally, these charts are representing the sound, the pressure in the sound wave at any given point in time. Keep in mind a sound is just a pressure wave. In an analog synthesizer, these waves are explicitly in the synthesizer as a voltage at some point, whereas in digital synthesis, you're representing the frequency at the pressure at any given point in time with a number mathematically. We're going to be using digital synthesis throughout the seminar, but for the most part, I'm going to try to keep things applicable to both cases, because there are some differences in the techniques you can use between the two, but until I note otherwise, everything is going to be pretty universally applicable. All right, so as I stated, digital synthesis, subtractive synthesis primarily works with starting with a waveform and then kind of carving away at it. And so our first step in analyzing how synthesizers work is to know what these standard waveforms are, what they sound like, how their partials work, that kind of thing. So in analog synthesis and by extension, a lot of simple digital synthesizers will use one of 4 waveforms, as you can see on the chart here. And the first of these is a sine wave. As we stated before, a sine wave is just a pure tone at a given frequency. So the frequency spectrum is going to be the frequency at that point and just nothing else. There's no overtones, there's no higher partials whatsoever. In my synthesizer here on the top right, you'll see a frequency chart, and if I play a sine wave, you notice there's nothing in the higher frequency, it's the note we play at and nothing else. And this makes sine waves sound boring, kind of sterile. And because, like I said, subtractive synthesis works on manipulating those partials, and there are no partials in a sine wave, you would think that they're not really used, but there is one very important case in which sine waves are used. As you get to the limits of human hearing, both high and low, your sensitivity overall goes down considerably, and also your threshold for pain goes down. So at those limits, it's better to use a simpler waveform, and mathematically there is nothing simpler than a sine wave. So for that reason, they're commonly used very low as subbasses and very high as whistles. So in this example, you'll hear, first example, you hear them as subbasses. There's 2 different subbasses we'll hear in this example. The first one has some other stuff going on besides, which we'll come back and analyze later on. But the key idea here is that both subbasses you'll hear are just a sine wave.
Like a map with no ocean. There's a limit to your love, your love, your love, your love. There's a limit to your care. So carelessly there. Is it truth or care? There's a limit to your care. There's a limit to your care. So carelessly there. There's a limit to your care. There's a limit to your love. Like a waterfall.
All right, sorry to cut it off there, but if you notice, we've actually, like I said, it's literally just a sine wave. We've actually already made this sub-bass pattern in our synth. It's just this. Is that too low to hear? What are you doing? Is that audible? Is the synth audible at all right now? Okay, good. Anyways, and like I promised, there also is the example of them in higher synths, in a higher registers. And in this example, we'll hear, as we get to the chorus of this example, we'll move from a sine wave to a triangle wave, which is the next waveform I promised we'll look at. So listen for that change. You'll notice when the higher partials get introduced, the sound becomes a lot richer, relatively speaking, so look for that.
Hey baby, get the bubble gum in this motherfucker, so. Right, baby, get some of you, dog. Study long, study wrong, baby.
With so much drama in the LBC, it's kinda hard being Snoop D-O double G, but I somehow, some way keep coming up with funky ass shit like every single day. May I kick a little something for the G's, and make a few ends as I breeze through. 2 in the morning and the party still jumping cause my mama ain't home. I got bitches in the living room getting it on, and they ain't leaving till 6 in the morning. So what you wanna do? Shit, I got a pocket full of rubbers and my homeboys do too. So turn off the lights and close the doors. But what? We don't love them hoes. Yeah. So we gon' smoke an ounce to this. G's up, hoes down, while you motherfuckers bounce to this. Rolling down the street, smoking in love, sipping on gin and juice. Laid back.
With my mind on my money and my money on my mind.
Rolling down the street, smoking in.
All right, so we'll move on here. The next other waveforms we'll all talk about at once because they're all kind of naturally connected close to one another. So as promised, the next waveform is a triangle wave. And if you notice, it looks similar to a sine wave, and because of that, it's in some sense similar to a sine wave in terms of its partials. It does have higher partials, but they tend to drop off quite quick, and due to some math reasons that we won't get into, it only contains odd partials, which is something you see happen in like reed-based instruments. So you often hear the tone compared to like being described as reedy. And like pay attention to the how fast they're dropping off in the top right-hand corner there. By comparison, a square wave actually has the same symmetry, and so it likewise only has odd partials. But because of some reasons we'll get into, it has a lot more of them. And if you look at it, you'll notice, unlike the sine wave and the triangle wave, the square wave has discontinuities, like it jumps immediately from the top position to the bottom position. This is where those higher frequency content comes in. And the other thing, though, on the flip side, is that in general, a principle we'll look at going forward is that like having large discontinuities in the waveform in and of themselves can be kind of unpleasant to listen to. I'm gonna go ahead and turn this down, but if we just listen to a raw square wave here, we see that there's a lot more of that higher frequency spectrum, but it's in and of itself kind of unpleasant to listen to. And the last waveform I promised is the sawtooth, which actually has that same drop-off rate as the square wave, but due to, once again, math reasons, it has both odd and even partial. So in some sense, it's the richest of the 4 waveforms, and because of that, it's the most commonly used, and for consistency's sake, it's the one we'll be using as we go forward. So just to play it a couple times here, so you get the idea without, just as is. And then I'm going to apply a filter from here on out to make it a little more tolerable, and we'll talk about that later on. So from here on out, we've covered the kind of fundamentals, and now we're going to get into each part of the synth and just some common like parameters on each of them and what they do, why you would want to use them. So first off, we have our oscillator. You can see here it's what I've been using to change the waveform we've been using. There's some other features. The interesting one here is unison. So if you think of like an orchestra, if you think of the string section in an orchestra specifically, it sounds a lot different than just a single violin playing. And the reason for that is you have multiple instruments that are naturally all going to be playing slightly different pitches. And it's that idea that we want to replicate with unison. There's 2 parameters. We have a voice count, which determines how many copies of our waveform we're playing at the same time. And we also have a width, which determines like how far apart the widest voices are. And this is usually measured in cents, where it is that 100 cents is just the distance between 2 adjacent keys on the keyboard. And this is a very common sound you'll hear. It's called a supersaw, which is literally just like a sawtooth with heavy unison and some filtering. And I mean, this is a very common, to the point of cliche sound in a lot of electronic music, I'm sure. I'm sure you've heard it a lot before in songs. I just have one example just to give the idea. The main pad in this song is a super saw, but I'm sure you can think of examples. I know that's a pretty short snippet, but we're gonna be tight on times here, so we're gonna move on. The next usual step in processing in a synth is the filter, which we already have on. This is pretty intuitive, but the idea here is especially easy to figure out with this graphic. The idea is that left to right on this graphic represents the low to high frequencies of our sound, and the lower the line is in the graphic, the more that those sounds are at that frequency are going to be filtered out, or just the quieter they're going to be made. Of course, like, we're working with a nice graphical synth here. On a usual synth, you won't have, like, this nice chart, but the idea is the same. You'll have a knob controlling the cutoff, which is what I'm adjusting right now, which determines just where we start cutting off the frequencies. And there's a couple other typical parameters. You'll have a slider controlling between a low pass, which lets the low frequency content through and filters out the high content, and a high pass, which just does the opposite. And you'll usually have a way of controlling the rate of drop-off. You see here right now is at 12 decibels per octave. You can usually switch that to 24. There are a couple features here on the filter which are maybe a little less intuitive though, which I want to cover. First is the idea of resonance. And so this is something you see just happen naturally in analog filters, where at the frequencies right around that cutoff point, they actually get boosted a bit, so you'll hear. And so the partials around that frequency will become louder than you'd expect them to be. And like this just occurs naturally in analog filters, but it's useful for shaping the tone. And so you'll often see it replicated in digital synthesizers like we have here. And the other thing I want to point out is key tracking. So going back to our discussion of the overtone series, right now our filter is cutting off at the same frequency no matter what we're playing. But as our notes get higher and higher, all the overtones are going to get higher as well. And so since our filter's in the same place, it's going to be cutting into that spectrum earlier and earlier, which means our higher notes are going to get kind of weaker in some sense. Like, let's see if we can hear it here. You hear as they get higher, they get less and less audible. And the idea behind key tracking is just that we move our cutoff to match the frequency of what we're feeding in. So with it on full here, you'll see that the filter will, in the diagram, will literally move to match the frequency of what we're playing. And like I said, your ear is like less sensitive towards higher pitches, so you may not want it fully tracking, and because of that, key tracking is usually presented as a spectrum. You can go between no key tracking and full key tracking and anywhere in between. Now, the purpose of filtering, beyond just like making the sounds more tolerable, not having all that excessive high frequency content in, they're actually used a lot often in songs to like control the relative volume and energy of songs. Like in the example we'll see here, as we get through the first minute, the filters will all start getting like higher and higher, and more of that high frequency content will be let through, which will kind of boost the energy as we hear. So the next piece that the sound is going to go through is an envelope. The strict definition of an envelope is just like it's part of the, it just sends out a signal that changes over time. In our case, we're looking at an ADSR envelope where the signal is going to change in response to how long a key is being held. And the usual purpose for this, like if you see an envelope, for example here, that's not labeled, the purpose will be to control the volume of the synth at any given point in time. And the basic idea of an ADSR envelope is we have a initial peak volume of the synth and then a volume that it's held at. And there's 4 stages representing the ADS and R respectively. We have the attack, which determines how long it takes to get to the peak. We have the decay, which determines how long it takes to get from the peak to the sustained volume. We have the sustain knob, which determines how loud the sustained volume is relative to the peak. And we have release, which is once you let go of the key, how long does it take for the sound to dissipate? So I have a very exaggerated example of an ADSR envelope here, but you should be able to hear it go through each of those stages as I play a note. And beyond just like controlling the volume, once again, these are commonly used to help shape the sound and make the envelope make the sound more interesting. And there are like 3 common envelope settings that you should probably be familiar with. The first is the normal one. I couldn't find a name for this. I've never seen it referred to with an explicit name, but it's what we have. It's just the typical one you'll start up with, where the idea is that the sound plays the moment you press the key and it stops the moment you let go. And I mean, this is the envelope that most of the synths we've heard so far have been used. The reason I'm bringing it up is because if you remember with our discussion on waveforms, I said that the general idea is that like discontinuities in our signal are going to be unpleasant to listen to. Like naively with a filter like this, you'd think because we want the synth to be playing instantaneously, you want to just set the attack and release to 0, so it plays the moment you start playing and stops the moment you stop. The problem with this, though, is that when you press the key, of course, the sound is going to be going from 0 to wherever in the waveform it's happening to start at, which can cause discontinuities. And so if we have our example here, it depends on where we start. We may not hear it, but you should be able to hear some like clicking in the synth as it snaps into place. As opposed to if we have the attack between like somewhere between 5 and 10 milliseconds is small enough that you won't really be able to hear it when you're playing or when you're listening back, but it's long enough that it'll smooth those sounds out and you won't get any clicking anymore. As for more like interesting, perhaps, waveforms, there's 2 other common ones. The first is called a pluck, and the idea is that we have the sustain at or near 0 and the decay relatively short. And this gives us a short staccato sound similar to like a string being plucked. We get this nice little. And so this is often used for like lead synths. It's a nice texture to be using. And I have an example of it here so we can listen to an example in a song. And you'll notice as it progresses how long it takes to get to the sustained volume, and that is kind of opens up throughout as we progress, and likewise the filters are also going to open up again, so it kind of leads to an interesting dynamic in the sound. It sucks that I keep having to cut off the songs at the good part. But next, the other example of a filter we'll cover is a swell. And the idea behind this basically is we just have a relatively large attack and release to kind of let the pads like gradually come in to give a more dramatic effect. And similarly, I have an example for this. The example, I tried to choose a more like subtle one that's less direct. You'll notice here, but when you listen to the synths in this one, you notice that they start about where the beat starts, but there's a considerable lag between when they start and when they actually like hit fully, if you know what I mean. Like when they reach their peak volume.
Will you look at me now? I'm already dead to you, but I'm inclined to explain what I could not before. Whatever you didn't do, what you couldn't say, I am sorry the worst has arrived, for I deserve more, for at least I deserve the respect of a kiss goodbye.
All right, and so at this point, we actually only have one topic left to cover, and that is LFOs and modulation in general. So if you look at this spot right here below the envelope, you'll see what looks just like a regular triangle waveform. But when I play some notes, you'll see the playhead here, and you'll notice a couple things. First off, it's going through the waveform much too slowly to be heard. Like it's only going through a couple times a second, like a couple hertz, which is well below the limit of human hearing. And just to skip ahead, LFO stands for low frequency oscillator. The other thing you'll notice is that the speed it's going through isn't following what pitch I'm playing, like if I go through higher. It's kind of just doing its own thing regardless of what I'm playing. And the reason is LFOs aren't meant to be heard. The idea behind them is more that, like I alluded to before, they're going to modulate other components. So what you can do is you can actually assign the output of the LFO to a given parameter. On an analog synth, we'll usually have like a list of parameters, but because we're in a digital synth, we can kind of just do whatever we want. So I can hook it up, for example, to the cutoff of this filter. And you'll notice as the volume of our LFO changes, as the output changes, so will this cutoff point. So and of course, this, if you're working with a synth inside like a digital workstation, you're going to have some tempo assigned to your song, and this will automatically synchronize to that tempo so that you can have it play on beat. And so we actually already saw an example of an LFO. If we go back to that very first example, that James Blake song, if we go to that first sub-bass pattern we heard, as promised, it is just a sine wave, but you'll notice that there's an LFO attached to the volume of it.
In slow motion, like a map with no ocean. There's a limit to your love, your love, your love, your love. There's a limit to your care.
So let's try to recreate that here. That's, like I promised, it's just a sine wave, but we see here that the volume of that sine wave, which is just the level here, is changing pretty quick, and it should just be something along the lines of that. I mean, like, it's not going to be the exact same speed, because I don't know what speed the tempo of this song's at, but that's the general idea behind it. And that's actually, oh right, I should also mention, you may notice here that we have the option for other envelopes in our synth. And of course, the idea is that you can just use those as well for modulating parameters with the same general idea that the output is just going to change what the level's at. And this is just a common way, I mean, just hooking up like a volume and an ADSR envelope to, for example, the cutoff of your filter is just a common way to like make it a little more dynamic. It's something you've probably heard in, you can probably notice in the examples we've already played. And so with that, that's actually all of the parts of a synthesizer, of a typical standard subtractive synthesizer. So you'd think that from here on out, you'd be able to just listen to like any synth and kind of decompose it. But this isn't usually the end of like the design process. Once you have a synth like this, it's usually common to run it through an effect. And the difference between an effect and a regular part of the anatomy is that effects don't depend on like what you're playing. Like for example, our filter, the cutoff is going to adjust to the frequency of the input due to the key tracking. And our LFO, for example, is likewise going to be changing other parts of the synth. An effect, on the other hand, is essentially just a black box, like I literally have one I brought with right here. You'll notice it's just like there's a place for the audio signal to go in and a place for it to come out. And there's no real specifics to the parameters. So like, for example, if you've ever played an electric guitar, it's the same as just a guitar pedal. And there are a lot of effects you can see on the left that we can run a synth through. I'm just going to give like a couple of the more interesting ones because we're kind of cut for time, but it would make good for a good seminar idea if anyone wants to go through like all the various effects, just putting that out there. But the first effect we're going to look at is distortion. The idea behind distortion is we're just like cutting off what the output is, and we're intentionally amplifying it. Like we're cutting off how high and low our waveform can go, and we're just cutting it off frequency if it goes past that part. And this will usually come with a drive parameter, which allows you to intentionally like push the sound into that limit. Like you'll see here, if I increase the artificial gain, we see the tops are getting cut off, and the higher we push the gain, you'll notice like we started with a sine wave, and it's looking more like a square wave the higher we push the gain. This is a kind of a good indicator to why you would want to use a distortion on your sound. It's like everything we've seen so far either pretty much leaves the partials the same or takes away. But if you remember, like a sine wave has no partials and a square wave has, relatively speaking, lots. So this is like one of the few ways where you can actually add high frequency content back in. So using a distortion in conjunction with a filter can give you a lot of control over what the harmonic series looks like. I'll try to give an example here briefly, but the song I'm going to play is going to do a much better job. But you'll see that we get that higher frequency content back in as we increase our distortion. And so the song I'm going to play here, well, here there's a very prominent bass part which really pushes distortion. It's very heavy. You'll see there's a lot of high frequency content, more than you'd think there would be. And also, not to skip ahead, you'll hear a lot of sample-based synthesis. There's a lot of like synthesizer-y parts which are being played with like little snippets of actual sounds. We'll get more into that later. All right, and the other effect I want to touch on briefly, the other one I consider like super important. I mean, they're all important to some extent, but the other one I want to cover here is reverb. So in any physical sound, along with just the main source of the sound, you'll naturally hear reverberations of the sound along like its physical environment. And because synths don't naturally have that, that can be a big cause of like why they sound artificial. And so reverb just kind of emulates that reverberation to kind of give them a more naturalistic sound. The most obvious parameter here we'll cover is just the decay time, which determines how long it takes for the sound to dissipate. And here we can get a big tail versus a very subtle one. Okay, don't worry about that. But the other thing I want to draw attention to is mix, which if you noticed we also had on the distortion. The idea is typically with an effect you'll have the dry signal versus the wet signal. The wet signal is just the sound with the effect applied, and the dry signal is with the effect not applied, essentially just the sound before the effect. And pretty much any effect will give you an option to mix between the wet and dry signal. So we can have it with just the reverb. And then as we go down in the mix, we'll get back to the original sound. And this is something you'll see on, you should see it theoretically on like any effect. But like I said, there's a lot of effects, you can spend a lot of time here. But to move things along, the last topic I want to cover briefly is alternative methods of synthesis, which we kind of covered briefly. So like I'm using Vital, which is a pretty powerful synthesizer overall. There's a lot of options for features that you wouldn't otherwise have. For example, first off, we have sample-based synthesis, which instead of having an oscillator running a waveform, we just have a sound we're playing back. For example, it comes with this bell sound. And we can set the playback speed to be based on what note we're playing so that the sample changes its pitch based on what note we're playing. So essentially pitch shifting it in a more natural way. Another method of synthesis I'm going to touch on briefly is wavetable synthesis. So far we've been using these basic waveforms because of their applicability to like analog synth and that, but from here on out we're going to talk about digital synthesis explicitly. I guess the sample synthesis was also digital explicitly. But because we're playing this on a computer, we don't need our waveform to be some like easily mathematically describable sound that we can reproduce with a circuit. We can just have any sequence of whatever here and just have our computer play it back. And that's the main motivation behind the wavetable synthesis. Like you'll see, you can just have anything. And besides that, we had like 4 discrete waveforms we were using before, but we can just like have as many as we want and have them like continuously change from one to the other. And of course, this opens up a lot of potential for sound design. I mean, like the idea of playing a sound and then a different one, you can get pretty much anything you want that way. So for just as an example, change my LFO to a sawtooth and we'll just have it go through. And you'll notice you can just like, okay, that's way too fast. We can kind of like, for example, this example, we have a supersaw sound just kind of like baked into our oscillators. You can also like take the sound of an actual instrument and cut it up and just like kind of almost emulate sample synthesis in a way. I know there's somewhere we can like take, for example, the sound of a cello and chop it up and just, or a clarinet. And I mean, you can see there's a lot of potential for sound design in this, which it's kind of hard to talk about even in general because you can just feed in any waveform you want. what the resulting effect is going to be really depends on what the person who made the wavetable set it up to sound like. But the last example I want to cover here is FM synthesis. So with our example of the LFO, we had we're modulating a parameter based on a waveform, but the waveform was occurring on like a low frequency at a rhythmic scale, so it is more an effect you hear over the course of beats. The idea behind frequency modulation in general is that it's the same setup as modulation, but we don't constrain the waveform we're using to modulate to be like at that rhythmic speed, where we can just have it be at an audible speed. And for math reasons, it has a very different effect than you would see with like our typical examples of LFOs. And like this, there are dedicated FM synthesizers. This example we have here is just like one parameter in an otherwise typical subtractive synth. And if you just see FM as a parameter, the idea is you're changing the pitch. So here we have a I have two oscillators going now. The second one is muted, but it's going to be modulating the pitch of the first one. And we'll just set our LFO to be going through like how much it's modulating by. And the effect is going to be very bizarre, I think. And I mean, in this case, our modulator's at the same frequency as the what we're modulating by. We can set it to be a different frequency, and we will get something a lot more intense sounding too. Like if we transpose it up a note, we'll get. And you can get all sorts of wild sounds, and that's just like a basic FM synthesis. On a proper FM synthesizer, we won't only just have like the typical subtractive synthesis setup with the option of modulating by an audible frequency, but you can modulate those modulators themselves, and like you can get very complicated like interlocking things of various oscillators modulating each other. And of course, the potential for sound design is very rich, but on the other hand, it's very like dense and confusing. Like I know how FM synthesis works more in detail in theory, but I've tried it out myself honestly, and it's kind of scary. But like, okay, we're actually on good time here. I've got one more example, which I think we'll use to end the seminar. We'll finally get to hear a song in full, and this is an example of FM synthesis used to like its full extent. You'll hear a lot of very wild sounds, and they're all built in this technique of using very complicated FM synth patches, which I couldn't hope to understand how they work. So look forward to that, and that's where we'll end things off, I guess.
My face is the front of shop. My face is the real shop front. My shop is the face I front. I'm real when I shop my face. My face is the front of shop. My face is the real shop front. My shop is the face I front. I'm real when I shop my face. My shop is a fake saffron. I'm real when I shop my face. So you see the one that I see in my dreams. Can't touch me, set my feet free. Test me, do you feel what I feel? You see what I see? Reduce me to nothingness. Yes, yes. My face is the front of shop. My face is the real shop front. My shop is the fake saffron. I'm real when I shop my face. My face is the front of shop. My face is the real shop front. My shop is the fake saffron. I'm real when I shop my face. My face is the front of shop. My face is the real shop front. My shop is the fake saffron. I'm real when I shop my face.
All right, and with that, we actually managed somehow to end on time, so thank you. All right, any questions? You got something, Jeff? You can turn on the lights first. Yeah, questions? Oh. Okay, you mind. I don't know, I wasn't seeing. All right, go ahead. Kind of. It's very questionable, I will say, but yeah. I don't think people want that. All right. Did you have a question, Jeff, or who? Someone had? Ryan. I mean, like I said, Sawtooth's like of the raw waves, but the whole point of waveforms, wavetables, you can get like. I got like 1,000 wavetables downloaded because people just put them online for free, so you can just get big like catalogs. That's where it's really at, I think. Any other questions? Yeah. I think theoretically you can reproduce any analog sound on a digital synth, but I don't know if like you would naturally lead yourself to doing that. Like. I mean, I think the best case study for that is like Boards of Canada, where everything's like fully analog. And I mean, like, while theoretically there's lots of like online tutorials which claim to be able to reproduce that, like, it's up to you to decide whether or not there are any like digital synth parts that do manage to get that kind of sound. Any other questions?
Is there like an artist that's like the most experimental with synth, or like that you look forward to?
My personal like benchmark, I guess, would say it's kind of maybe a bit of less intuitive choice, but there's someone called Venetian Snares. And while you think of them as like a breakcore artist, drum focused, there's a lot of very creative synth work in his stuff. And so I would point to there if you want like creative experimental synth stuff. And I mean, of course, there's artists like Sophie in that too as well. So I rented off on that. Any other questions? Oh. Yeah?
How are sounds made of waves?
Well, there's Fourier series. There's pressure in the air, and the diagram represents how much pressure is in it at any given point. I guess like the middle line is the whatever the ambient pressure is. Above is more pressure, below is less. Is the basic idea, I would say. but 4A series is the better answer. Any other questions? Oh yeah, I was going to mention that. One of the nice things about Vital, why I chose Vital Use as a synth, it's a freer, like the industry standard for software synths right now is arguably like Serum or Massive. And the whole point of Vital is it can reproduce essentially what those can do. It can actually run the same wavetables as they use, but it's entirely free. So, and like there's a lot that Vital can do, which I haven't even touched on. Like there's 2 full tabs here, which we didn't even really look at of stuff you can do. So I highly encourage everyone who's interested, you can download Vital, it's free, and just like play around with it. Any other questions?
Yes.
Me? Yeah. Chaumont. Chaumont is a typical anglicization. It's Chaumont, I guess, typically. It's there's a town in France. It's the same as that, so you can look that up. Oh yeah. Joseph.
I have a genuine question.
All right. All right.
All right. Thank you again, Joseph. Next week, we have our second ever guest talk. Sid Normal is going to come and we will have free pizza with her. She's going to talk about her DJ and experimental music performance / creating. And also, she plays in a duo called Psychic Chambers. I will get to you in a second. Be patient. So look forward to that. Yeah. All right. See you at Dewey's and see you next week. Talia, you had a question? Come up. Or do you want to do it in front of the entire class?
Are you gonna make sure to get pizza for everyone?
Yes. Yes, that concern will be addressed. Thank you for checking, though. Okay, see ya.